ever scroll through news about the India-China border and feel like you walked into the middle of a movie?
It can definitely feel that way.
We're diving into that tangle history today,
Yeah,
going way beyond the headlines.
absolutely.
You've shared some excerpts from Nitish Rajput's video, India-China Dispute Explained.
It's a good one.
Where do we even begin?
Well, the current border dispute is just the latest chapter in a story that goes back centuries.
Okay.
It's easy to get lost in the back and forth,
Right.
but the video does a great job pulling back to show how we got here.
Okay, so rewind to the 7th century.
At least that far back.
I mean, how does a border dispute even exist that far back?
Because back then, we're talking empires,
Right.
not modern nation states.
Right.
The borders were more like zones of influence, constantly shifting based on power dynamics and alliances.
I see.
Think less about lines on a map, more like overlapping paint strokes.
Okay, that image definitely helps.
Good.
But somewhere along the line, those blurry lines had to become more defined.
They did, eventually.
When do we see the first attempt at a formal border agreement?
The Treaty of Tingmosgang in 1684 is a good starting point.
Okay.
It's the first time we see a written agreement trying to formally draw a border,
Okay.
specifically between Tibet and the Ladakh Kingdom,
Okay.
which is where things get interesting because Ladakh is currently claimed by India.
So Tibet and Ladakh trying to make things official.
Ah.
But then what's this about China being involved in the 1842 Treaty of Tusul?
This is where China's rise under the Qing dynasty really starts to impact the region.
Okay.
By 1720, it established indirect control over Tibet.
Right.
Fast forward to 1842,
Okay.
and we have the Treaty of Chusul
Okay.
between the Dogra Empire, who controlled Ladakh,
Yeah, okay.
Tibet, and here's the kicker, China.
Mm.
Even though China didn't directly border Ladakh at the time,
Right.
they became a signatory to this treaty that reaffirmed the old established frontiers between Ladakh and Tibet.
Old established frontiers.
Yeah.
Sounds ominous, like this is where the lawyer speak starts.
Right.
Why is that phrase so important?
It's important because it's the crux of India's current claim over a very strategic region called Aksai Chin.
Okay.
By agreeing to uphold these old established frontiers,
Right.
China indirectly acknowledged Ladakh's claim to Aksai Chin,
Okay.
which, after Indian independence, became part of India's claim.
So China sort of backed themselves into a corner with that agreement.
You could say that.
Did they ever try to challenge it?
They didn't explicitly challenge it at the time, which is interesting.
Okay.
But it highlights the ambiguity surrounding these agreements.
Right.
Old established frontiers leaves a lot of room for interpretation.
Okay, so we've got shifting empires, vague agreements.
Yeah,
I'm starting to see how this becomes such a mess.
for sure.
And I'm guessing the British Empire couldn't resist adding their own brushstrokes to this already messy canvas.
You're right. The British definitely added to the complexity.
Right.
Their rivalry with Russia,
Okay.
often called the Great Game,
Right.
was all about control and influence in Central Asia.
Right.
The British were determined to secure Ladakh as a buffer against Russian expansion.
Geopolitical chess.
Exactly.
So how did this play out in terms of the actual border?
In 1865, a British surveyor named W.H. Johnson proposed a boundary,
Okay.
now known as the Johnson Line.
Okay.
It encompassed strategically vital areas that would give British India an advantage.
Classic power move.
Right. I bet China wasn't thrilled.
Not really. But their response was interesting. Instead of outright rejecting the Johnson Line,
Okay.
they initially chose not to formally acknowledge it.
Wow.
A tactic we'll see them employ again later.
Strategic silence, right?
Exactly.
Biding their time.
Yeah.
I can't imagine the British appreciated that very much.
Tensions were definitely simmering.
Right.
By 1899, possibly to appease China,
Okay.
the British offered a compromise with the McCartney-MacDonald Line.
Ceding a significant chunk of the disputed Aksai Chin.
So the British were willing to give up some of what they'd claimed.
They were?
That seems
Yeah.
unlike them.
Right.
Was it out of the goodness of their hearts?
Highly unlikely.
Okay.
This was a period of intense geopolitical maneuvering.
Right.
And the British had their reasons for wanting to keep China on their good side, at least for the time being.
But didn't this concession just create more problems down the line? Especially when India gained independence.
You're already thinking ahead.
Well,
And that's exactly what we'll be unpacking in the next part of this deep dive.
right.
Hold on to your hats because things are about to get even more complicated when we enter the era of independent India and a newly communist China.
We're back, and last time we left off with the British Empire adding their own brand of chaos to the India-China border situation.
It's a tangled web for sure.
Now we're entering a whole new era with Indian independence.
Right.
Did things get any clearer?
Not exactly.
Okay.
If anything, the situation became even more fraught.
Right.
India inherited these messy, vaguely defined borders just as the global landscape was being redrawn.
And on top of that, you've got these competing narratives swirling around.
Right.
Like that whole thing about Nehru giving away India's UN Security Council seat to China.
Yeah.
What's the real story there?
Right. It's a classic example of how a simplified narrative can obscure a more complex reality.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Nehru advocated for the People's Republic of China to hold the UN Security Council seat.
Right.
But the context matters.
Uh-oh.
At the time, the seat was actually held by the Republic of China, based in Taiwan. Nehru's stance was part of his larger foreign policy vision of promoting newly independent nations and a multipolar world.
So less about giving away and more about advocating for a new world order.
Exactly.
But even with that diplomatic approach, I'm guessing things with China weren't exactly peachy keen.
Sadly, no.
Okay.
Behind the scenes, a very different story was playing out.
Okay.
While publicly promoting friendly ties.
Right.
Mao's China was actively laying claim to significant portions of Indian territory.
The classic, one thing said in public, another done in private.
Exactly.
What was the turning point for India? What made them realize that China's words and actions didn't quite match up?
A road.
A road.
In the 1950s, China began constructing Highway G219 through the very heart of the disputed Aksai Chin region. And they did so without India's consent.
Bold move.
Right.
Building a highway through disputed territory is practically a declaration in itself.
It's a statement for sure.
How did India respond?
Initially, India's response was somewhat muted.
Okay.
They were dealing with internal challenges, and there was still a belief that dialogue could resolve the issue.
Okay.
But the highway was a wake-up call.
Right.
It exposed China's intentions in a way that words never could.
And unfortunately, this all culminated in the 1962 war.
It did.
Right.
China launched a surprise attack.
Right.
And the month-long conflict resulted in a significant military setback for India.
Right.
With China gaining control of territory, particularly in Aksai Chin.
A devastating blow for India.
It was.
But I imagine this defeat forced them to rethink their entire approach to border security.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The 1962 war was a harsh lesson.
Right.
Highlighting the limitations of diplomacy without a credible defense.
Okay.
India realized it needed to bolster its military presence along the border.
Okay.
It marked a shift from a primarily diplomatic approach to one that recognized the need for military preparedness alongside dialogue.
So a change in strategy.
Right.
But did it actually change anything on the ground?
The 1962 war didn't magically resolve the border issue.
Right.
But it did lead to the establishment of what we know today as the Line of Actual Control.
Okay.
Or LAC.
The LAC.
Yes.
This isn't a formal border, though, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
It's more of a reflection of where both sides held territory after the war. And it's this LAC that has been the focal point of tension and conflict ever since.
Especially with China's strategy of salami slicing.
Right.
It's one of those terms you hear thrown around.
Yeah.
But what does it actually look like in practice?
Salami slicing is a strategy of gradual encroachment.
Okay.
It's about taking small, calculated steps to shift the territorial reality on the ground without triggering a major escalation.
So death by 1,000 cuts, essentially.
Basically.
How has China been able to get away with this for so long?
A combination of factors.
Okay.
First, they've been relentless in developing their infrastructure along the LAC roads, outposts, air bases.
Right.
This gives them a logistical advantage.
Okay.
And makes it easier to deploy troops and equipment rapidly.
And how does that contrast with India's approach?
India, unfortunately, was much slower to develop its border infrastructure.
Okay.
Part of this was due to the challenging terrain, bureaucratic hurdles, and perhaps a lingering hope that dialogue alone could prevent further conflict.
A hope that unfortunately proved to be somewhat misplaced.
Right.
Are there specific instances where this salami slicing has led to direct confrontation?
The 2020 Galwan Valley clash is a prime example.
Right.
China leveraging its superior infrastructure.
Right.
and taking advantage of India's limited presence in the area,
Right.
made a move to secure a strategically vital ridgeline.
And that resulted in the deadliest clash between the two countries since 1962.
It did.
A stark reminder that those small slices can have very real and tragic consequences. And we're back for our final descent into this India-China border dispute.
The final frontier.
We've covered centuries of history.
We have
From vague treaties to all-out war.
the whole shebang.
So, given all this baggage, where do things stand today?
It's a tense situation, to say the least.
Okay.
You've got this line of actual control that isn't a formal border.
Right.
And China's salami slicing tactics, constantly testing the boundaries.
Right.
As we discussed, the 2020 Galwan Valley clash was a tragic reminder of how quickly these incremental moves can escalate.
It's unsettling to think about.
Yeah.
Especially with all the news about China's activities in the South China Sea.
Right.
Their growing influence in places like Sri Lanka, and those reports of continued incursions along the LAC.
Right.
It paints a worrying picture, doesn't it?
It does raise concerns, China's actions, not just along the Indian border,
Right.
but throughout the region,
Right.
suggests a strategy focused on asserting dominance.
Right.
And one of the tools in their arsenal is this relentless infrastructure development we keep discussing.
Right. Nitish Rajput was very clear about that in his video.
Yeah.
He talked about how China is building roads, bridges, even entire villages near the LAC.
It's incredible.
It's almost like they're trying to create their own reality on the ground.
It's a strategic move, no doubt.
Yeah.
By establishing a physical presence,
Right.
they strengthen their claims
Right.
and make it that much harder for India to respond without risking a major confrontation.
It's like they're playing a long game while India is forced to play catch-up.
It seems that way.
Is there anything India can do to counter this strategy, or are they doomed to just react to China's moves?
India is certainly aware of the challenge
Okay.
and has been taking steps to address it.
Okay.
They've been rapidly developing their own border infrastructure,
Okay.
bolstering military presence,
Okay.
and engaging in diplomatic efforts to de-escalate tensions.
Right.
But it's a delicate balancing act.
Trying to deter aggression without provoking a larger conflict.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder, is there any hope for a lasting, peaceful resolution to this centuries-old dispute?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
The future is uncertain,
Right.
and the potential for miscalculation or escalation is always present.
Right.
However, it's important to remember that both sides have a vested interest in avoiding a full-blown war.
Right.
The economic and human cost would be catastrophic.
So there's a sliver of hope even amidst all this tension.
Exactly. And that's why understanding the nuances of this dispute, going beyond simplistic narratives, is so important.
Right.
Diplomacy, dialogue, and a clear-eyed assessment of the historical and geopolitical realities are crucial for navigating this complex landscape.
Well said.
Thank you.
It's been quite a deep dive, to say the least.
Yes.
We've gone from ancient kingdoms to modern-day standoffs, all because of those blurry lines drawn centuries ago.
And those lines continue to have very real consequences today.
Right.
It's a reminder that the past is never truly past,
Right.
especially when it comes to matters of borders, power, and national identity.
Absolutely. We'll leave our listeners with this thought. As China continues its rise and India seeks to secure its own place on the world stage, what will become of this volatile border? And what role will the rest of the world play in shaping that future? Until next time, keep learning, stay curious, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive